All right, hello out there. Welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we try to take aim and focus on great theories of everything. All-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, cosmologies, magnum opuses, and tour de forces. Earth-shattering discoveries that if you only knew about them, they would revolutionize your life in ways that would help you to shift your paradigms, help you with your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, your quest for sovereignty and freedom, and your awakening to 5D consciousness. Today is our 10th video that we've done on the book by Bajent and Lee called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. And if you don't know, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 in a series of caves in Qumran, about 20 miles from Jerusalem. They were discovered over the period of a few years. I mean, the first discoveries were in 47, but they were still hauling stuff out of there much later. And the documents contain a lot of Old Testament texts, and they also contain what they call sectarian material from the sect that wrote the documents in the first place and had their kind of monastery there near those caves in Qumran. The consensus is that they stashed them all there in 68 AD when the Roman legions started to come down on them after the Jewish revolt in 66 AD, and they probably date back 2 or 2.5 centuries before that. For that whole period, this sect, or maybe a couple different sects, were living in those caves, and they had a lot of tenets and rules and ways of doing things, and those things were written down in these scrolls as well. They had a thing called the Manual of Discipline. They had a lot of biblical commentaries that also shed light on the way they lived, and it turns out that they used a kind of a language, a jargon, that is really very strikingly similar to a lot of the phrases that are used in the Gospels. So this find sheds light not only on the Old Testament but also on the New, and on first century Palestine in general. But the deception that is involved is really that the texts were, now they're mostly in Hebrew, some of them are in Aramaic, and they have been assigned to this international group of scholars who turn out to be mostly Catholic priests who must have seen something they didn't like, because they kicked the can down the road for like 40 years before they published much of anything of any worth. And the renegade members within the group who did try to publish stuff, they kind of had their careers ruined. So this guy Giza, Dr. Giza Vermes, who eventually did write kind of a definitive survey of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It says about him, he's certainly as competent to work on unpublished Qumran material as any member of the international team, and is probably better qualified than most. Yet for the whole of his distinguished academic career, access to that material has been denied to him. He has not even been allowed to see it. So they pretty much tried to monopolize this stuff, and there's something that was in it that they didn't want to come out. Not going to say what it is, don't know what it was, but nobody acts like this, where you have this once in a lifetime, once in a millennium type of archaeological find, and you do everything that you possibly can to make sure that no one ever finds out about it or what's in it. Okay, so we're going to take over from here and see where we go. In the meantime, valuable evidence continues to remain under wraps. We ourselves can personally testify to vital material which, if it has not exactly been suppressed, has not been made public either. In November 1989, for example, Michael Bagent visited Jerusalem and met with members of the current international team. One of them was Father Emile Puech, the young crown prince of the École Biblique, who so-called inherited. They had the gall to some of these people who were assigned originally to look at the scrolls, got old and died while they were doing so, and they had the gall to bequeath their scholarly portion to their research assistants or whatever. Like that is it was something that they owned. So who inherited the scroll fragments previously assigned to Father Jean Starkey. These included material labeled of unknown provenance. In personal conversation, Father Puech divulged 3 important discoveries. 1, he had apparently found new overlaps between the scrolls and the Sermon on the Mount, including fresh and significant references to the poor in spirit. 2, in the Epistle of Barnabas, an apocryphal Christian text mentioned as early as the 2nd century, 2nd century AD, Puech had found a quotation hitherto untraced, attributed to an unknown prophet. The quotation, in fact, proved to have come directly from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, thus establishing that the author of the Epistle of Barnabas was a member of or had access to the Qumran community and its teachings. Here was an incontrovertible link between Qumran and Christian tradition. 3, in the work of 2nd century Christian writer Justin Martyr, Puech found yet another quotation deriving directly from the Qumran scrolls. Quote, we are not hiding anything, Puech insisted adamantly. We will publish everything. To our knowledge, however, none of the revelations confided by Puech in conversation has yet appeared in print, and there seems to be no immediate likelihood of their doing so. On the other hand, there has been a recent leak which offers some indication of the kind of material still being suppressed. This leak surfaced in 1990 in the pages of the Biblical Archaeological Review and was confided apparently by an unnamed scholar whose conscience was troubling him. It consists of a Qumran fragment very similar to a passage in Luke's Gospel, referring to Jesus' imminent birth. Luke in chapter 1, verses 32 to 35, speaks of a child who will be called, quote, Son of the Most High and Son of God. The Qumran fragment from Cave 4 also speaks of the coming of someone who, quote, by his name shall be hailed as the Son of God, and they shall call him Son of the Most High. This, as the journal points out, is an extraordinary discovery. The first time that the term Son of God has been found in a Palestinian text outside the Bible. Whatever the circumstances pertaining to the release of this fragment, it derives from the corpus of material hitherto controlled and rigorously withheld by the elusive Father Malik. Okay, that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 is called Opposing the Consensus. Edmund Wilson, John Allegro, and Giza Vermes all condemned the international team for its secrecy, for procrastination and delay in releasing Qumran material, and for establishing a scholarly monopoly over the Dead Sea Scrolls. Wilson and Allegro both challenged the team's labored attempts to distance the Qumran community from so-called early Christianity. In other respects, however, all three scholars concurred with the consensus of interpretation established by the international team. They accepted, for example, the team's dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls as being pre-Christian. They also accepted the team's contention that the members of the Qumran community were Essenes. And they accepted that the supposed Essenes at Qumran were of the traditional kind described by Pliny, Philo, and Josephus. Ascetic, reclusive, pacifist, divorced from the mainstream of social, political, and religious thought. If Christianity were indeed somehow connected with the Qumran community, it therefore emerged as less original than had hitherto been believed. It could be seen to have drawn on Qumran just as it was acknowledged to have drawn on conventional Old Testament Judaism. Apart from that, there was no particular reason to modify one's image or conception of it. I just want to point out that Pliny, Philo, and Josephus are really like the only commentators that have ever, from contemporary commentators, that have ever referred to the Essenes. And Josephus is totally discredited as far as I'm concerned because he worked for the Roman Caesars, and Pliny also worked for the Roman Caesars, and I believe that Philo did too. I think that Philo worked with Nero even. So I'm not sure about that though. So, you know, I question the existence of the Essenes at all. And I don't believe that any of these scholars are doing that. They've all just kind of accepted Josephus, particularly Josephus's description of the Essenes. But Pliny and Josephus were definitely buddy-buddy with Vespasian and Titus, the Roman emperors. And, you know, turned their histories into propaganda pieces for them. Okay, by the 1960s, however, scholarly opposition to the international team's consensus had begun to arise from another quarter. Its questioning of that consensus was to be much more radical than anything submitted by Wilson, Allegro, or Vermes. It was to challenge not only the dating of the Qumran scrolls as established by the international team, but also the allegedly Essene character of the Qumran community. The men responsible for this criticism were Cecil Roth and Godfrey Driver. Now, remember, Godfrey Driver was originally the advisor of John Allegro, but then he denounced Allegro certainly after he put out that Sacred Mushroom and the Cross book in 1970. But I believe we're still talking about an earlier period here. Cecil Roth was perhaps the most prominent Jewish historian of his era. After serving with the British Army during the First World War, he had obtained his doctorate from Merton College, Oxford, as an historian. For some years, he was reader in Jewish studies at Oxford, the post now occupied by Vermes. He was a prolific writer with more than 600 publications to his credit. He was also editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia Judaica. He commanded enormous respect in the academic world and was recognized especially for his expertise in Judaic history. Godfrey Driver was a figure of comparable academic stature. He too had served with the British Army during the First World War, seeing action particularly in the Middle East. He too taught at Oxford at Magdalen College. Beginning in 1938, professor of Semitic philology. Until 1960, he also did 3 stints as professor of Hebrew. He was joint director of the team which translated the Old Testament for the New English Bible. As we have noted, he was John Allegro's mentor and recommended Allegro for the international team. From the very first discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Professor Driver had advocated caution about the early pre-Christian dates ascribed to them. In a letter to the Times on the 23rd of August 1949, he warned that the pre-Christian date ascribed to the Qumran scrolls seems likely to win general acceptance before being subjected to critical examination. In the same letter, he stated, quote, "The external evidence for a pre-Christian date is extremely precarious, and while all the international evidence seems against it, internal evidence seems against it." Driver stressed the risks of attributing too much accuracy to what he called external evidence, to archaeology and it's not paleography, it's paleography, which is, it's a weird kind of decipherment for figuring out the dates of stuff. I think, I can't quite remember what it is. It's a little bit controversial. He advocated rather a scrutiny of the internal evidence, the content of the scrolls themselves. On the basis of such evidence, he was eventually to conclude that the scrolls dated from the 1st century of the Christian era. In the meantime, Roth had been conducting his own research, and in 1958 published the results in a work called The Historical Background of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The historical background, he argued, was not pre-Christian, but on the contrary, dated from the time of the revolt in Judea between AD 66 and 74. Like Driver, Roth insisted that the texts of the scrolls themselves were a more accurate guide than archaeology or paleography. Availing himself of this guide, he developed a number of points that not only ran counter to the international team's consensus, but must also have outraged the Catholics among them. Citing textual references in one of the scrolls, for instance, he demonstrated that the invaders regarded as adversaries by the Qumran community could only be the Romans, and further, could only be Romans of the empire, of imperial rather than republican times. He also demonstrated that the militant nationalism and messianic fervor in many of the scrolls had less in common with traditional images of the Essenes than with the zealots described by Josephus. He acknowledged that the original community at Qumran might indeed have been established by Essenes of the traditional kind, but if so, he contended, they would have vacated the site when it was destroyed in 37 BC. Those who occupied it subsequently after 4 BC and who deposited the scrolls would not have been Essenes at all, but zealots. Pursuing his argument a step further, he then endeavored to establish links between the Qumran community and the fierce defenders of Masada, 30 miles to the south. And so Masada was the last bastion for the Jews there in that war, and they held out for like 2 years there against the Romans. And so those were the zealots. Then they all committed suicide when it was a totally lost cause. Now that the Roman imperial Rome started, I guess, with Augustus I think that was like 29 BC. So he's saying that the people that the invaders that are referred to by the Dead Sea Scrolls were Romans of the empire. So so he's saying it's from after 29 BC. And I guess the site in Qumran was destroyed in 37 BC, but I thought there was an earthquake there in 31 BC. So I don't know if that's the same event, and maybe there's two different datings, or otherwise I wasn't sure that there was any type of destruction there in 37 BC. 37 BC is the first year that Herod became the king, though. So he might have destroyed them. Such assertions, needless to say, provoked indignant criticism from Father Devoe's team. One of Devoe's associates, Jean Carmagnac, again, Devoe is the leader of the international team and is a Dominican Catholic, in reviewing Roth's book, complained that Roth does not miss any occasion to closely link Masada and Qumran, but this is another weakness of his thesis. Even when, 8 years later, Yagel Yadin, in his excavations at Masada, found scrolls identical to some of those discovered at Qumran, the international team refused to consider Roth's thesis. Quite clearly, some sort of connection had to exist between Qumran and Masada. Yet the team, their logic now creaking painfully at the seams, insisted only one explanation was possible. Some of the Essenes from Qumran must have deserted their own community and gone to the defense of Masada, bringing their sacred texts with them. So far as Masada was concerned, Roth was, then, to be vindicated by Yadin's excavations. But he was also quite capable of fighting his own battles. In an article published in 1959, he focused particularly on Devoe's assertion, based on supposed archaeological evidence, that the scrolls could not have been deposited any later than the summer of 68 AD, when Qumran was taken by the 10th Legion. Roth demonstrated conclusively that the 10th Legion in the summer of 68 AD was nowhere near Qumran. Roth's arguments may have infuriated Devoe's international team, but they were shared by his colleague Godfrey Driver. The two worked closely together, and in 1965, Driver published his massive and detailed opus on the Qumran material called the Judean Scrolls. According to Driver, arguments to establish a pre-Christian date of the scrolls are fundamentally unsound. The sole reasons for establishing such a date were, he pointed out, paleographical, and these cannot stand alone. Driver agreed with Roth that the scrolls referred to the period of revolt in Judea between AD 66 and 74, and were thus more or less contemporary with the New Testament. He also concurred with Roth that the Qumran community must have consisted of zealots, not traditional Essenes. He calculated that the scrolls could have been deposited at Qumran any time between then and the end of the Second Revolt in Judea, which is the rebellion of Simeon Bar Kokhba, AD 132 to 135. He was scathing about the scholarship of the international team, as exemplified especially by DeVoe. Roth and Driver were both famous, acknowledged heavyweights in their respective historical fields who could not be ignored or cavalierly dismissed. Their prestige and their learning could not be impugned or discredited. Neither could they be isolated, and they were too skilled in academic controversy to put their own necks in a noose, as Allegro had done. They were, however, vulnerable to the kind of patronizing condescension that DeVoe and the international team, closing ranks in their consensus, proceeded to adopt. Roth and Driver, august though they might be, were portrayed as out of their element in the field of Qumran scholarship. Thus, DeVoe, reviewing Driver's book in 1967, wrote, quote, "It is a sad thing to find here once more this conflict of method and mentality between the textual critic and the archaeologist, the man at his desk and the man in the field." End quote. Not, of course, that DeVoe spent so very much time in the field himself. As we have seen, he and most others on the international team were content to remain ensconced in their scrollery, leaving the bulk of the field work to the Bedouin. But the scrollery, it might be argued, was at least closer to Qumran than was Oxford. Moreover, DeVoe and his team could claim first-hand familiarity with the entire corpus of Qumran texts, which Roth and Driver, denied access to those texts, could not. And while Roth and Driver had questioned the international team's historical method, they had not actually confronted its excessive reliance on archaeology and paleography. Archaeology and paleography appeared to be the team's strengths, allowing DeVoe to conclude his review of the Judean scrolls by stating confidently and definitively that Driver's theory is impossible. He could also, by invoking archaeology and paleography, dazzle other figures in the field and effectively hijack their support. Thus, Professor Albright was persuaded to weigh in against Driver, whose thesis, Albright declared, has failed completely. Its failure, Albright went on, derived from an obvious skepticism with regard to the methodology of archaeologists, numismatists, which I think is the study of coins, and paleographers. Of course, he, Driver, had the bad luck to run into head-on collision with one of the most brilliant scholars of our day, Roland DeVoe. Moving on to the offensive, the international team and their colleagues continued to bombard Roth and Driver with increasingly contemptuous criticism. Both, as Eisenman has observed, were ridiculed in a manner unbecoming their situation, and with such ferocity as to make one wonder. No one dared support them. No one dared risk the wrath of the now solidly entrenched consensus. And the scholarly sheep, as Eisenman says, fell into line. So far as Roth and Driver were concerned, their interests and reputations weren't confined exclusively to Qumran research. In consequence, they simply retired from the arena, not deeming it worthwhile to pursue the matter further. That this should have been allowed to happen testifies to the timidity and docility of other researchers in the field. It remains a black mark in the record of Qumran scholarship. If the international team had exercised a monopoly before, the position now appeared to be unassailable. They had outmaneuvered two of their most potentially formidable adversaries, and their triumph seemed to be complete. Roth and Driver had been driven to silence on the subject. Allegro had been discredited. Everyone else who might pose a threat had been intimidated into compliance. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the hegemony of the international team was virtually absolute. Okay, that's kind of a break. A new section is starting within this chapter. So we're going to cut it off there, and we will pick up tomorrow at this point. Thanks for tuning in today. Please come back tomorrow, and